Time magazine saying climate change is going to kill more people than infectious diseases. CNN out there saying, it's probably 250,000 people a year from climate change conservatively, right? They've already started messaging that climate change is killing people, and so now they want to add this as cause of death so that they can just count up as many as they want. What's the goal? The goal is to justify things like this.
Matthew's paper really was about what we might want to do to make ourselves, how we might ethically edit ourselves for climate change, for example. So I'm really curious to hear where you take all of this.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm probably more on the more permissive side of this whole spectrum. I think that I agree with everybody here that in the near term, the research should go forward. I don't see much of a big problem with sort of synthesizing yeast, genomes and or studying sort of aspects of the human genome. My view is that what we need is a really robust ethical framework, and within this robust ethical framework, I think there's a way going forward where we can do this ethically. But there's actually a lot of opportunities for this to solve big world problems. So one thing is the climate change. And there, I'll just use, climate change is a really big problem. We don't really know how to solve it. But it turns out that we can use human engineering to help us address climate change. So I'll give 2 examples. So one is that people eat too much meat, right? And if they were to cut down on their consumption on meat, then it would actually really help the planet. But people are not willing to give up meat. Some people will be willing to, but other people, they may be willing to, but they have a weakness of will. They say, wow, this steak is just too juicy. I can't do it. I'm one of those, by the way. So, but so here's the thought, right? So it turns out that we know a lot about, we have these intolerance to, for example, I have milk intolerance. And some people are intolerant to crayfish. So possibly we can use human engineering to make it the case that we're intolerant to certain kinds of meat, to certain kinds of bovine proteins. And there's actually analogs of this in life. There's this thing called the Lone Star tick, where if it bites you, you will become allergic to meat. I can sort of describe the mechanism. So that's something that we can do through human engineering. We can kind of possibly address really big world problems through human engineering. Another example is,
you go first.
Yeah, and another example is and here I'll go first, right? You'll see that I'm the smallest person here, right? And Amy's the smallest person. So it turns out that the larger you are, think of the lifetime greenhouse gas emissions that are required to the energy that's required to transport larger people rather than smaller people, right? But if we're smaller just by 15 centimeters, right? That's a mass, I did the math, and it's about mass reduction of 25%, which is huge. And 100 years ago, we're all on the average smaller, exactly about 15 centimeters smaller. Right? So think of just the, lifetime greenhouse gas emissions if we had smaller children, right? And so that's something that we could do through some human...
Could we, setting aside, should we?
Yeah. Yes, setting aside, should we? Don't need to ask that question. He's just a bioethicist after all, Matthew Lau, as he calls himself. It's the only reason he gives lip service to a robust ethical framework, as he suggests that we should genetically engineer people against their will to be meat intolerant, or give people cat-like eyes that reduce the need for lighting at night because of our carbon footprint. Or we can genetically engineer our children to be the size of cats because over their lifetime they'll have less greenhouse gas emissions. These are his suggestions, and ladies and gentlemen, yes, they sound crazy, don't they? They sound equally ludicrous as vaccine passports sounded 18 months ago. But given the right crisis, and given the appropriate amount of fear pushed out through the propaganda outlets, you can see how people would line up for these things just as they are, virtue signaling as they get their kill shots right now. And it's not just Matthew Lau who's out there saying these crazy things. No, he is walking hand in hand with Klaus Schwab and the people at the World Economic Forum, how bioengineering will change our world in the next 10 years. This is what it means when he talks about biohacking and cybernetics as part of the Great Reset, as part of this fourth industrial revolution, engineering a post-human world, where, as you can read right here, citizens vaccinated by consuming edible vaccines and plants. Well, no wonder they need control over the food supply. No wonder it's going to be illegal for you to have a garden, right? Because, ladies and gentlemen, this is their plan, and there's no one coming to save you. I'm sorry to tell you. It's going to be up to you to get the word out, and for all of us to fight this right now. And why am I talking about this? Why is Christian going off about, humans the size of cats? What does this have to do with food? Because if I just say that they're shutting off the world food supply, then I sound crazy. But it's not until we have a cup of tea, pine needle tea, and acknowledge their own words, their own plans are so crazy, are so satanic, and this transhumanist future that they have envisioned is being created by virtue of this huge crisis, this worldwide famine, climate change. They'll blame for it. And I'm not the only one saying this at this point. In fact, just last week, a Dutch member of parliament stood up and saying, we're going to have food shortages if we keep replacing our fertile agricultural lands with these wind farms. This is insanity, and it must stop. Well, now that we've taken, I'm not holding back anymore, ladies and gentlemen. I never did, but at this point, we've got to be all in. And so that's why I wanted to really do the deep dive into the motivations behind why they're just turning off the food. And now let's talk more about how they're doing that.
With drastic limits placed on what little water they have.
We've all made serious choices of what fields we can water and what we can't.
Tom